All right. So for our podcast here, the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast, my goal is always to ask questions from the listener's perspective to try to help. And so I've got a guy on here, our guest tonight, Parker McDonald. I actually just saw him. I don't know if it was in a podcast group or what, say something about starting a podcast. And if you're going to start a hunting podcast or an outdoors podcast, what would you do? And we had almost like opposing thoughts on it, because Parker said, learn to hunt, be a good hunter, and then have a podcast, and or something to that effect. And I come at it from a completely opposite perspective. It's like I'm, on the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast, I'm the world's worst bow hunter. So not just on our podcast, but the world, terrible bow hunter, awful. This year, I even missed 2 different times with a gun. So it's been a season. But on the other side of that, what better guy to have on to talk to the world's worst bow hunter so he can pick his brain than a guy who is having probably one of the best seasons that you could imagine. And our friend, previous guest here, Parker McDonald. How are you doing today, Parker?
Man, that was man, you like, I don't even know how to follow all that stuff up. Like, even if you say you're the world's worst bow hunter, you're probably the world's most humble bow hunter by that whole little thing right there. So props to you on that. I didn't even realize that we had opposing views on that. I don't know if I saw your response on that post.
No, I said, think of your listener. I think, but like we've talked about this before, but like I started a podcast because I like have this like thirst for knowledge, and I wasn't finding the information that I wanted to get. Yeah. And what better way than to be able to pick people's brains? But even when we talked before, you're like, well, I mean, I feel like you got to be a good hunter to like talk about it. I'm like over here kicking rocks, like, yeah, I completely agree.
No, I think you're underselling yourself though, because like you said, you missed these deer with a gun, missed deer with a bow, whatever. Last year you shot a pretty great buck, if my memory serves correctly.
Yeah.
In a tough state to do it in. I think you sell yourself short. I think in the grand scheme of like hunting, like you probably know what you're doing more than 60 to 70% of the people that are out there in the woods. You know what I mean? You're able to carry on a pretty educated conversation with somebody else, so with somebody who is in the upper percentile. You can carry on that conversation. And so I think definitely you are, right where you need to be. And the other thing that you do really well is when I've listened to you before, like you kind of say like, hey, I'm not the best hunter in the world. Don't ask me if you expect to get anything that's going to help you kill deer or whatever. You're pretty straightforward about that. And you don't go around like, dude, I'm telling you, like one of my pet peeves is podcast hosts or YouTube channel guys or whatever, any type of quote unquote influencer that's like trying to give tips and tactics on how to do this and that and the other without a whole lot of a track record of being able to kill deer, Oh, so, yeah. No, I think you sell yourself short, man, because I've heard you talk about deer hunting, watch your stuff, listen to your stuff, and you definitely know what you're doing. You know what you're talking about. But yeah, you are correct. This season has been unreal for me. I'm just now, right now, before we got on the call, I shot a buck yesterday on Christmas Day, and it's on the boiling pot, boiling that head so that we can get it back to Alabama. I'm in Texas right now with my family for Christmas break. And the crazy thing about this buck is just like, I hadn't seen a deer all week. Like that's the first deer I saw all week long. Hunting my dad's property. He's got 18 acres here in East Texas. So not Texas like you think of, like brush country and senderos and big giant bucks walking around everywhere. He's in East Texas, almost in Louisiana, so it's more like swamps, a lot of like red oaks, sloughs and water, standing water everywhere, flatland. That's kind of his property. It's probably not what you imagine when you think of Texas. And so he's owned it now for 9 years, and this is the first big buck I've shot off of it in those 9 years, and he's only shot like two. So it's not you don't go out there with the expectation like I'm going to see a big buck in December. That's just not something that typically happens. So that was pretty cool. And it's weird because it's like of all the seasons that it could have possibly happened on, it's this season where I have felt like for the month of December, at least, I felt like when I walk into the woods, I have a pretty good chance at killing a deer just because of the year. And I don't even feel like I'm necessarily doing anything different. It's just this year, man. This season's been crazy.
Well, I think that that's one of the things, talking to a lot of these guys that are, and I guess I need to change. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of things like when you're talking about my hunting, I feel like maybe the difference in my hunting versus, or my perception of my hunting versus guys like yourself, and I'll say that, you'll get the picture here in a second, is that I feel like the guys that are, consistently getting it done or killing or whatever, are closers, right? That's where I lack, and I've said it before, and I have that, I'm missing that portion of like sealing. Like I saw two great bucks. I saw 30 deer this morning, I think. I had 11 does within 50 yards, and that's a lot of eyes to try to get drawn. And
Yeah.
we're in Michigan here, so there's no leaves, there's no nothing. I was just up over this evergreen, and I don't think that the deer saw me. Something else was going on. There was something to the north, but regardless, I mean, I have, and Christmas Eve, I had a deer at like 15 yards. I was at full draw, and they just stopped right before, and ended up, they like drafted me or something. But it's that closing.
Mhm.
It's that last little bit of sealing the deal. And like the last time you were on, I brought you on almost specifically to ask you, like, how do you deal with that influencer type thing, that having a podcast, that doing all this video, all this YouTube and everything, and then going out of state and shooting like a 3-point in velvet or something like that, where it's in
Definitely done that a couple times.
and in this day and age where, like I've got a buck that's behind me right here. It's like a little 6-point I shot on our property in the UP. That means a lot to me. I shot it with, my brothers and my whole family and everything. And people are like, whoa, it needs another year. Like, what are you doing? Like, you've never hunted this property to see like what the caliber of deer are there,
Yeah.
and then, and so from that conversation, like, it's like, you got to kill a lot of deer to be able to put it all together, I think, like to be able to do that. And so for you, you say the month of December, you just feel like you're going into the woods and it's just going to happen. And I think that because of the success, whether it's year over year or for you, it seems like week to week, it's going in there with that confidence. And if you haven't killed a lot of deer, for guys that are just starting out, I feel like that's one of those intangibles that you can't really teach somebody, right? So
Yeah, I had a guy, man, it was probably last week. I had a guy reach out to me, and he said, hey, I'm wanting to start self-filming. Do you have any advice? I was like, yeah, dude, my number one piece of advice for self-filming is while you're starting, like in the beginning phases of self-filming, shoot every legal deer that you can and try to get it on film and practice, because the only way to practice, you can't practice shooting deer on film. Like there's no way to practice that. You can't do that with your target. It has to be something moving. It has to be something alive. Like just go out, have fun, kill deer on camera, kill does on camera, practice those shots. And I think it's the same thing with just deer hunting in general, like learning. I shoot a lot of does in the early season, like as many as I can in those like first 3 weeks of Alabama season. I shoot as many does as I can. And that's really just to kind of shake the rust off, like just get used to shooting deer. We can shoot a doe a day out here. So just get used to it. Like that, like it's been a year since you've practiced on a moving target. So let's figure let's get back into the swing of things. So that way when I do start like focusing on bucks, I can be a little bit more comfortable. I can be a little more calm, even though I'm not. Like it's almost impossible for me to be calm when I'm shooting at a buck. But yeah, you're exactly right. Like I've shot my first deer of the season was a 4-point velvet buck in North Dakota. And he was just a little bitty joker that I shot on the last day. But I mean, got it on film. Everything was good. Like it was a great video. Like everything turned out well. It's kind of a long story, but I went to hunt private land. It wasn't working out there. So with 2 days left in the trip, I decided to rent a car and go hunt public land where I could shoot whatever I want and have a good time and kind of get back to my normal stuff. And so I shot that little 4-point velvet buck, which was pretty cool.
Well, I think that's awesome. And I've really tried to like embrace that idea. I went to Wisconsin for 3 days, like the 2.5 hunt. I think I had 5 sits in Wisconsin this year. And every time I went out, I saw a deer. I moved around until it felt right. And I passed like the smallest little 8-point ever. And in my head was like, what would have Parker done? He would have shot it. And that, it was the last morning. It wasn't the last evening. And I don't regret not shooting it. Like I didn't shoot a deer in Missouri a few years back. And we talked about that I regret shooting. Like that's one where I was like, but this one I don't think I would have shot in Michigan. This was the smallest 8-point I've ever encountered in my life. Like his antlers weren't over top of his ears, let alone outside of his ears. It was just wild. But from all of that, you're talking about all of these different states. How many states have you hunted total?
Oh, total. Let's see. I might have to actually just like count them out for real quick.
Yeah.
Started out hunting in Texas. So that's where I was raised at. So hunted Texas, hunted Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Dakota, Missouri. That may be it. I think that's it. And I've hunted a lot of those this year. So this year I've started out in North Dakota, I started out in Tennessee with a velvet hunt, went to North Dakota. After North Dakota was Alabama, then Tennessee, then Kentucky, now Texas. And then I'm going to Florida next week to do a hunt with Walter, our buddy Walter.
Yep.
I'm doing that hunt, and then after that hunt, I'm going to Mississippi. So Mississippi will be a first time. Never hunted there, so that'll be pretty cool. I'm pretty excited. Oh, I've hunted Nebraska for turkeys too.
So the reason I asked that is because we've got listeners from all over, as do you. But like when I get asked questions, or like I even try to relate to like Walter's talking about hunting, a lot of the things just seem so easy to me to like try and break down. And he's like, you don't understand. And I was even thinking about it, like after the season, there's no snow to go follow tracks. There's no beds to check out. So what is different about hunting like the southern states versus your experiences in the Midwest?
So there's a couple of things that really stick out. So you can go to Kentucky. Let's just take Kentucky for example, because that's probably the I probably have the most out of state, like non-resident hunting is done in Kentucky for me. The deer there, they're just, you can get away with so much more. So just in a hunting scenario, for example, you can get away with like, I've had deer come in from downwind multiple times in Alabama. Man, that almost never happens. Like I can blow 400 yards away when they get downwind of you. But like in Kentucky, North Dakota, states like that, like it just seems like you can have more encounters because the deer aren't nearly as skittish. So that's probably the number one thing. Now, when you look at a state like Florida, deer just aren't. There's not a lot of deer, so you have a really low deer density. So you can be in a spot that looks like it should just be perfect, or at least a spot that you should see a deer on a sit, on a, let's just say a morning sit. You could sit in a spot where it's like, yeah, there should be a deer. If I was hunting a spot that looked just like this in wherever, even Michigan, I know Michigan has a pretty high density, just not great maturity levels, I guess, for bucks is what I've heard. But you can go in a state like Michigan and at least see a doe. That still might not be what you were looking for, but at least there's deer moving through. Man, I have had so many sits here in Alabama, or there in Alabama, and even here in Texas where you got corn feeders going, where you just don't see deer. Like the buck I shot the other day, like I said, me and Dad hunted all week, and he saw a spike that he shot, and I saw this 8-point that I shot in the week. Like that's all the deer we've seen all week long. So density is a big thing out here. And then cover, man, the South is just thick. You think like I've hunted hardwoods going back to Kentucky or even North Dakota. I hunted North Dakota in September where it's all the leaves are all on, everything's green. It should be at the thickest that it gets. It still wasn't that thick. Like it was wide open. I've hunted Kentucky in September and everything is just so open. So if a deer moves within 100 yards, 150 yards by you, you'll see it. Here in Alabama, you don't have a lot of just wide open, like super wide open woods. Like it's so thick. There's a lot of gullies, a lot of ditches, terrain makes it tough, but you may not see a deer unless it gets within 50 yards, in a lot of places. So the cover that they have to move around is just so much better. It's so much thicker, I guess. It may not be better, but it's thicker. So that's one thing. Like I've heard that Alabama has a pretty high deer density compared to the rest of the US, but when you hunt it, you just don't feel like that. It does not feel like it has high deer density.
So as you're traveling around, what is it that you're looking for specifically to, have the level of success that you've had or have been having?
So I guess my success rate went up really high. Probably 5 years ago, I guess. I've limited out in Alabama. So I've killed my 3 bucks, 4 out of the last 5 years. And the year that I didn't limit out, I shot my best buck I've ever killed in Alabama and another pretty solid deer. So it still was a pretty good season. And that was about 5 years ago when I really started focusing on these things. And I almost get tired of talking about it because I talk about it so much on my podcast. So it'd be nice to talk to some of your listeners about it, is hunting these. I had a guest that really put it in a really good descriptive word, and it was X marks the spot. When you can find vegetation, transition, hard edge transition lines on a map or whatever, you see it in person where you have 3 to 4 or more different types of habitat meeting together in one spot. Whenever I started focusing on that, and like that being like the main thing that I'm looking for, like I said, in states like Kentucky, where you have these wide open woods, if you can find these transition lines and hard edges and higher stem count areas, dude, it's almost a no-brainer that that's where deer are going to be at. And then you start adding in terrain features. So you have your hard edge transition, 3 or 4, making somewhat of an X mark on the map that you can visibly see. And then you have some type of ditch that goes through it, or you have a creek that runs right through that, or you have a bench or a saddle or some type of terrain feature that is close by or leading into that transition. Then you've been able to effectively cross off the majority of your WMA or national forest or whatever it is that you're hunting, because you're being so specific to these certain things. I call them, it's a common denominator spot. I started looking at, when I would see deer on the side of the road, I would pull up my maps. I would, at the time, pull up my onX and look at why is a deer here? Why is a deer crossing the road right here? If there's a spot where I always see deer on the way into town or whatever, and look at your map and see, like, why is a deer here? Or when you're hunting and you see a deer, look at your map and be like, okay, why is that deer coming in that way? And the common denominator always seemed to be changes in habitat, hard transition changes in habitat. The deer were either walking those, coming out of it, whatever. And that just seemed to be like the ticket. And then I started fine tuning it into finding the terrain features. Those were just even, that bring up the odds even higher that you were going to have good encounters with deer. And then after that, you're talking about time of year, right? So hunting them when it's right. If you've got a spot where all October or all September you've been seeing does just piling out of these areas, they're likely bedding somewhere close by. And then once you get into the rut, pre-rut, rut and post-rut, where you have the potential to find bucks cruising, you can just about guess they're going to be cruising. They know that does follow that line all the time. So they're going to be trying to cut these doe trails, scent checking, doing all that stuff. So I would say that's the number one thing whenever I'm in another state that really ups my odds pretty big. And sometimes, I go on a whim and say, well, there's a lot of sign here at this creek crossing or something like that. I'm not going to say that I hunt that type of spot 100% of the time, because there's definitely other things that I will throw a hunt at too. Creek crossings, thermal hubs, just a plain Jane saddle. When I'm in Kentucky, deer seem to just use saddles more out there. When the bucks are running does, those does will just cross right through the middle of those saddles, just like they're supposed to. So things like that, I don't cross those off all the time, but they're not going to probably be the object of my affection, I guess, for the lack of better words. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about thermal hubs, but before we get to that, and it might, factor in here, but just for an example, like you had brought up the hunt in North Dakota, right? So you went there, it wasn't happening on the private land. So when you decided, because this is one of the things, like when I hunt out of state or even around here, I mean, in Michigan, we're really fortunate to have tons of public land over here where I live on the west side of the state. So, I mean, where I've been hunting is maybe a 25-minute drive, but I pass 4,000 acres on my way to get to where I'm hunting. I've got, property that I can hunt, state land, whatever, within, I think it's 8 minutes when I timed it to go. So
I can't imagine that. That'd be awesome.
Right. And so, it's a blessing and a curse too, because you get so locked into hunting this one spot, or like, that there's deer there, why leave deer to go find deer, and then, the more I dig into this, I find out that, these guys that are consistently killing big bucks or whatever, they might drive 3 hours from their house to a spot and then 4 hours to another spot because that's where it holds the big deer, or they have an opportunity to kill the age class buck that they're going for. It's just a different level. So, and when I've been hunting out of state, we always kind of stay nearby where we're hunting. And I mean, I think we've driven, an hour this way or that way, in a typical rut hunt where, especially if you're after the time change, you're getting up, you want to get in there an hour before daylight. So you're 2 or 3 hours before daylight, and then you wait until dark, and then it's an hour drive back. You barely have enough time to eat dinner and then go to sleep to get up in, a handful of hours. So like going from that example that you had, you're hunting on private, you decide to rent a car and drive like 2.5 hours. Like, what was it, a place that you knew where you were already familiar with, or is just like, what made you choose that particular area?
So in North Dakota, there's not a lot of public land is a big part of it. There's not a lot of WMAs, not on the side of the state we were at anyways. And so I flew in to this specific trip to hunt with all the guys from Tethered. They had a lease there in North Dakota, invited me to go and hunt it. I mean, the property carried giant deer. The problem is that we couldn't really be super mobile because it was everything you think of when you think of North Dakota. You think of big giant marshes, flat, treeless, with like tiny little shelter belt strips of trees. And so we had all of our spots on these shelter belt strips of trees. And if the deer weren't coming to those bait piles and stuff out there, then and they weren't, the bucks were not at all. And Jared Schaefer is a great example. He was able to get mobile and hunt from the ground on that hunt, and he had some encounters with some absolutely just nasty giants, just big, huge bucks that nobody else was seeing. I could have done that. I've definitely thought about it. The problem was that I didn't have a cameraman, and I film everything. And so self-filming a hunt like that is nearly impossible. Like, you can't do that. And so for me, it was, I had some of these guys had went to this specific area the year before, seen a lot of good deer out there. And it was just more what I know. I love, there was more trees to set up in, like, it was that kind of just stuff that I know, more terrain. So the area I was in had some pretty steep stuff, mountains and hills, and mostly hills. And so I could read it better just with a short amount of time to hunt it. I could read it. I knew what I was looking for. And, I figured deer is a deer. They're going to act fairly similar in terrain as they do back home. And so, but the difference here or in North Dakota was there's just more. There's more of them. There's more deer, and they're bigger deer. So that was kind of my thought process. So what made it worth it? Like, I had literally not seen a single buck in the 7 days that I had been on this private land. So it was kind of, for me, and we had trail cameras, we had cell cameras at every single spot out there, and just weren't deer coming to them in the daylight. So for me, it was a no-brainer. I could sit here and have absolutely zero confidence that I'm going to see a deer because I know they're not coming through here, or I could go and try to make something happen. And so that was why it was very easy for me to do that. So I rented this little tiny shoebox car as a Chevrolet Spark, about the size of a Tic Tac box, and just went around and scouted till I found something good. And that hunt was, it was crazy because I really only had like 2 sits in the whole time that I was there, because I scouted and I wanted to hunt twice. And the first day I went in and scouted, I found good sign, but I didn't see any deer. And then the next day, I'm trying to remember what I did. That morning, I scouted that whole morning. And this is early season, right? So you're keying in on a lot of food sources, trying to find white oaks that are dropping acorns, and up there, way up north, they're dropping at that point. And so the evenings is pretty much the most valuable time to hunt, whereas mornings is kind of like, in my experience hunting Midwest deer, they just, mornings are just a little less opportunity. So I go in and scout this piece, actually talk to a local guy, and he was like, you need to check out this big chunk over here. Nobody even knows that it's public. It hadn't been public until this year. There's a lot of people saying that it's not public, but it is public. And it was on the map, showed up as public. So I went and scouted it, and I walked like 200 yards away from my car, and this big, huge, giant buck got up out of his bed and just kind of trotted off, and he didn't like bust out of there. So I knew he was going to be there close. So I went back to camp, kind of gathered my thoughts, tried to figure out why was that deer there. And the reason he was there is because thermals were, it was a small thermal hub, and he had the advantage from literally every direction. The wind was blowing over his back. So he was getting the wind there. But when you're actually standing right there where he was bedded at, it felt like the wind was in his face because it was blowing over top of there, going down into that bottom. And then there was several little small points going down to a creek that was holding water. And they were just like, everything was just like making a big giant cycle, like a whirlpool almost, just wind coming from every direction. So I went back in. That was going to be my last sit that evening. And so I thought, okay, this is my best chance that I just need to go set up close to where he was at and hope that he comes through. So I ended up bumping him again that evening. I made a really not aggressive move, I wouldn't say. I just made a big giant circle around the area that he was bedded in. And as soon as my foot stepped into the wood line from the field, he got up and ran off. So I was like, well, he may come back. Doubt it. He's been bumped twice today, but I'm going to shoot the first buck that I see because it's the last day. And right there around 4:30, man, this little 4-point velvet buck decided he wanted to walk through there, and he caught an arrow. And so that was kind of where I started. I mean, I've always thought about thermals, and maybe this is a good transition into what you told me you wanted to talk about. I've always kind of thought about thermals, but those little hubs like that, that's kind of where it not clicked, because I knew what they were, I knew how they worked, but I really had a visual representation of, how deer are going to use it. And now that was an early season thermal hub where he was just bedded up on it because it offered the best advantage. But I really started keying in on him this year during the rut in Alabama, and ended up taking 2 of my 3 bucks off the same thermal hub, like a week and a half apart. And pretty much, if you watch the video, I pretty much, before I killed the first one, I predicted, okay, if a deer is going to come through here, here's where I think he'll come from, and here's why. And I telling you, it was an hour later, and he was like, it's like he was up there listening to me talking. He was like, I want to make this guy look really, really good. And that's what happened, man. It just worked out. And so just really keying in on that. And I've had a lot of feedback on it. People saying like, man, I've heard everybody talk about thermal hubs. I've acted like I knew what I was talking about when I talked about them, but I really had no idea. Thanks for making that and making it so easy to understand. And it is a very easy thing to understand once you kind of get a grasp on it, for sure.
So explain to me, like, outside of walking into one like you did there in North Dakota, when you're starting to key in on them, or what you're looking for or looking at now, like if I was to look on Base Map, or if I was to look on Spartan Forge, or I'm looking at this topo map, or I'm looking at this, like, how does it lay out?
Okay, so if you imagine a bowl, right? Like if you're looking at a map and you see a big, huge bowl, right? Now imagine there's a bunch of fingers off the top of the ridge going down into that bowl, or you've got 3 or 4 ridges coming down and emptying down into the same bottom. And it really, when you're standing in it, it looks just like a bowl all the way around you, except for the main creek that you probably walked in on. All the way around you is ridges, um, and big, and you're talking about, you got fingers going up either side on both your right and your left, and another one in front of you, or maybe two of them in front of you, and they're all dumping down into that same area. And that's what you're looking for on the map. You're looking for as many fingers coming down into one central location. And my buddy Clayton Bond killed a giant buck in Kentucky this year on public land with his bow on one of these thermal hubs. And it just seems like I've killed two and have had more than that in encounters with bucks on these places. And it seems like they're just so predictable in what they're going to do, depending on the time of the day that the deer comes into it. You can pretty well predict how they're going to come into it and set up for a shot. But the problem with them is that the reason people who know what they are don't always hunt them is because it's very easy to get busted on a thermal hub, especially if you're bow hunting. I gun hunt, I rifle hunt in Alabama because we can. We have a very long rifle season, so I rifle hunt once the season comes in, and they're a little bit easier to hunt with a rifle because even if your thermals are, going every which direction, a lot of times you're able to get a shot off before the deer gets into that stream.
So let's talk about a lot of times when we talk about hill country or whatever, and you think about all these fingers, or these crow's feet, or all these things that are coming down, they're always talking about like betting on points, blah, blah, blah. So how are the deer using these thermal hubs? Both, so in the morning, if you were going to set up on one in the morning, or if you were going to set up on one in the evening, how are the deer using them? Are they just moving through? Are they using them to scent check during the rut? Are they using them to J hook into a bed based on, the wind?
The answer, I believe, is yes, right, to all those.
Yep.
When you are looking for a thermal hub on the map, one of the things that you're going to probably figure out pretty quick is there's not a lot of them. So let's just say you have a 1,000-acre WMA, and there's two different spots that you could consider a thermal hub. The chances that bucks in that area are using those thermal hubs are very high. If there's not a lot of them, I mean, that's a very advantageous place for a deer to be. So the chances of there being deer sign and deer using them is very high. So back to your question, I think during the rut, I think they're still going to use it for bedding, and all deer are going to use it for bedding. So that's where you got to be really careful, because you have all those different points dropping down into those areas. The does are going to be using it for bedding and crossing, if they're feeding down low at night in the creek bottoms, they're going to be popping back up to those tops to bed, where it's typically going to be a little bit thicker up on the tops. I'm personally looking for the ones that maybe have a pine thicket or something like that up top, just because that tells me that there's probably bedding if it's got good cover, and it's a point and it's on a thermal hub where they got all this different advantage. There's likely going to be deer bedding on them. So you can, I like hunting them on a wind that is going to be pretty low, not a super heavy wind, but a lot of times your wind down in those hubs, you still want to get in there in a way that you're hunting the wind direction, but you just have to know down in these little spots, your wind's going to swirl so bad. It's going to do all kinds of crazy things. Your thermals are going to be rising, early in the morning. This might be the easier way to describe it, is just to kind of tell you how I would hunt them, and what I would expect deer to be doing. So I don't hunt them in the evening most of the time. I want to access in the morning before daylight. So If you know just like thermals 101, it would be your thermals pulling down when it's dark and rising in the daylight. That's kind of thermals 101. There's a little bit more specific. So once the sun hits those bottoms and hits the creeks, that's when it starts to rise. So usually where I'm at, where I hunt, you're looking at probably 8 o'clock, 8:30, maybe 9 in some areas. That's when your thermals are going to start rising. And then when the sun is no longer hitting that, your thermals are going to be falling or dropping. So I want to access in such a way where my thermals are dropping. I want my thermals to be in the advantage if I'm accessing the spot. So I'm going to access low and I'm going to hunt low in the mornings. And what you would do is before the sun hits, before the sun hits there, you might expect deer. If a buck happens to be cruising before the thermals start rising, he's probably going to be cruising down low because he's wanting to catch the thermals dropping down from all those points. So you can expect that they're going to, if you see one early in the morning, they're probably going to be dropping down into the bottom. Does that make sense? Is that pretty simple to understand?
Yeah,
You think?
I'm very disappointed by this because when I was talking about hunting Wisconsin earlier this year, I found that exact spot, and I was
Mhm.
like, "There's no way I can hunt this," because the wind was just so wild, and I was like, the creek down below, everything coming down, and I'm just
I'm
now
gonna I, I'm
now
gonna
it's like
give
I
you
just
an
know.
example of I'm gonna give you an example of how to hunt one and maybe help the wind be more your thermals be more advantageous for you, even when they're right, even when stuff's doing goofy stuff. Um, I know this is Bow Hunter Chronicles, but I'm gonna get a little bit Gun Hunter Chronicles on you too.
Oh, that's fine. But the thing is like from what you're saying, like I can see this. Like I've been standing in that spot, going, I know that this is a spot, but where in the world do you set up right here?
So, so when you think of, let's just think of when your thermals are dropping, right? So early in the morning, late in the evening, and then all night long. So we don't see this uh, because usually we're asleep when the deer are doing this, but those bucks will cruise down low in the dark. That's why in these bottoms and during the rut, you're seeing rubs and scrapes and just tore up sign down low in these bottoms. And then in the daylight, you're not seeing them. They're like, why aren't the bucks here? But they're cruising down low because the thermals are dropping. They're not cruising those side hills and all that stuff. They're cruising down in those bottoms. They're just walking them. And that's why you're finding all these scrapes and rubs down low. Uh, and so whenever I see that kind of sign down low, I, it helps me know that there's deer in the area, but I may not be necessarily expecting to see deer come from there just because most of the time during the rut, I don't see a lot of bucks at first light. Like I might see some does every once in a while, but I don't see a lot of first light bucks cruising. Usually they're cruising the side hills, uh, or even if you're even farm country, you catch them cruising most of the time, but sometime between, for me, it's 9 and 11 is typically the time when I see bucks start getting on their feet during the rut. Probably a lot of that's because they've been out doing their junk all night long and just getting a little bit of rest before they get back up. I don't know. But so you find that sign in there. But then they're going to basically do when the thermals start rising. So let's talk about between the hours of, let's say, 8:30 and 5 in the afternoon. Your thermals are going to be rising up. And that's when you're going to start seeing those bucks cruising the tops or cruising the sides, cruising those areas where they get the wind in their advantage and the thermal in their advantage, which is called thermal tunnel, right? And so they have the wind going over their back, the thermals rising up to them so they can smell everything from every direction. And the hubs give them even more advantage than that. Now I have seen when I'm bow hunting in early season and I go into a thermal hub, I'm going to try to find the point that has the best opportunity for bedding for those deer. Because the bucks aren't going to be cruising at that point. They're going to be going from food to bed early in the morning and from bed to food late in the evening. So I'm going to try to find the spots that are going to be more likely to have a bedding area and get between them and that food. And somehow try to make sure that my thermals don't screw it up before I even see the deer. And same thing, late season, I think it'd be the same thing. I'd probably be getting closer to whatever food source I could find in that case. But so that's kind of thermals 101 for you. But what you find with the thermal hubs is most of the time outside of that, you're hunting one feature. You've got one ridge and you're hunting a bench on that one ridge. And that might work. I mean, it works for me from time to time, or you're hunting that one hard line transition. And that's great. When you're hunting a thermal hub, you literally have like 3 to 4, 5, maybe, or more different ridge systems that you have opportunity for deer to be dumping down off of. So you just upped your odds like 5 times because you could potentially have deer coming from every direction. I find I find a thermal hub to be the most productive during the rut, and I won't even hunt them. Honestly, it's not even worth it to me to potentially screw up a deer in the area by hunting a thermal hub in the early season. I want a buck that I can at least have to where he's more prone to be fooled because he's got hot dough on his mind rather than a buck who is just weary and old. And early season bucks, they kind of suck. They're hard to hunt. Rutting bucks are just a little bit easier. So I'd rather go into that type of situation, at least having that on my side.
So when you're talking about, like, it seems counterintuitive, right? That you'd want to go into this spot on a low wind day, because, like, thinking of the place that I'm thinking of, it was just all riddled with scrapes everywhere. Big giant, truck hood scrape in the middle, and then down below that, halfway between that and the creek, was just scrapes everywhere. Then there was a creek, and it had kind of all of the things that you're talking about, even with the 4 different types of terrain changes. And you're standing there going, man, this is great. And so I'm thinking of the wind for the next day. In the wind, there was going to be like just a draft, when I'm thinking, well, standing here, the wind's just swirling, thermals are going this way and this way. I'm planning on hunting all day. And it was like a really easy access spot. That's why I didn't end up hunting it, because if I had one day to hunt, and there's a mode path that goes right to this, I'm thinking, what are the odds that I'm going to get run up on right here? Like, probably pretty good. So I didn't hunt it, but I'm thinking in my mind, if I had like a stiff wind, I would know where to be so that my wind wouldn't be just swirling around in here. But
all right,
what you're saying is you want the deer to be comfortable with the thermals. So rather than having a wind that's going to mess up their predictable pattern, you're saying they're doing this for a reason, because the thermals are consistent. So you want it to be as much consistent as possible, and then you just use that as your.
Yeah, for a buck that's scent checking, he's not going to come in there if it's not advantageous for him. You know what I mean? Like, he may not hit it that day. If it's just like stupid high winds, he may not go into there because the wind is going to override thermals most of the time. And so if that wind is overriding all the thermals, then he doesn't have any really reason to go check out the thermal hub. Because at that point it's just a bowl, and it could still be good because, like I said, you still have, 4 or 5, however many different ridges are coming together right there dumping down. You still have that many ridges dumping down. And so they may be crossing over to get from one ridge to the next in those type of places, in which case I would probably try to find the crossing by sign. You can usually find the sign where they're just crossing right there, because it's just a good intersection for a buck that's cruising a ridge. You know, if he's cruising the leeward side of the ridge, he may still do that, and you might catch, you know, you have 5 different opportunities. Instead of just hunting one ridge, you're hunting 5, and they're going to dump down together, and you might just be at an intersection, which is a heck of a spot still. And I think that's where I hear a lot of old school guys talk about, like, oh, we've been hunting that forever, we just didn't call them thermal hubs. I think they were hunting it with that, more of that in mind. Like, I have 5 times the opportunity, or 3 times the amount of opportunity to catch a cruising deer dumping off of one of these ridges. And so, but yeah, I definitely would be less likely to hunt it on a strong wind day. But when you think about what is the most, I don't know the word that I'm looking for. What affects thermals the most? And it's water, right? Heat and water. Water is going to be cooler. The sun's going to be hot. That's what's pushing and pulling the thermals is colder air, which is going to be around water. So in a situation like, I'll just talk about the first buck that I killed in Alabama this year, because it was in the thermal hub, and he's the one that I pretty much just predicted what he was going to do. So I set up, I went in, set up, and walked in the bottom. I accessed from the boat, so I'm walking in at the lowest elevation really all the time. And I walk into this bottom, get almost like smack dab in the middle of this hub in the bottom, but I get on the left side of the creek. I'm expecting deer to come from the right side of the creek, right? That's the most gradual slope. It seems like the most likely place that a buck will enter the thermal hub from and go and check. On that specific day, the wind was going to be blowing. That was going to be the 100% leeward side of the ridge. A buck could be cruising down there, and then he ends up in this thermal hub. And so I want him to be right there. So I'm gun hunting at this point. What I'm going to try to do is get in such a way where, even no matter if my thermals are rising or falling, they're going to be in my advantage for that spot. So I got the creek between me and where the deer is. Drop milkweed on a creek early in the morning before the sun comes up. It's going to probably pull down into that bottom, hover over the creek, and then it may just pull straight down into the water and wash away, or it will just follow the current of that creek. Does that make sense? Your milkweed will, when you drop it, it'll just follow. So if that buck comes on that side, he would have to cross the creek to get my wind at that point, because it's just going to follow the current of that creek. When my thermals start rising, well, then the water is what's pushing them. So it's going to push up to me. It's going to push behind me. So I'm hunting in a way where the wind direction is already going behind me, or going in my face. That's the prediction for that day. The only thing that can change that is if my rising thermals or my falling thermals are affected by it on a lower wind day. And in this type of setup, it's kind of bulletproof unless a deer happens to come from behind me, which I'm going to be screwed. If you are the type of person that's hunting the wind direction most of the time, if a deer comes in from downwind, you're just going to be screwed. Like, you set up in a way that's the least likely place a deer is going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
In my situation, it's just a lake back there. So a deer would have to have already been back there in the morning when I got there. All the land, all the property is back here in front of me where I think the deer is going to come from anyway. So you set up in a way where the water, or the bottom, whatever it is that's causing the thermal pull and rise, is going to be an advantage for you no matter what. it's a puzzle, man. It's like, it's such a puzzle. And that's just one part of it. Like just finding the thermal hub is one piece of it. And then figuring out how you're going to set up is another piece of it. You know, you just, it's a lot of things. So I can imagine for somebody listening to this who's like, holy freaking crap. I don't, that sounded like Spanish. The number one thing that I would say, if you don't get any of this, get some milkweed, start dropping it and seeing what it does. You'll start learning, you'll start seeing the pattern at different times of day, what your milkweed's going to do. Don't get the powder, don't get that crap, because it's not going to really show you what stuff is going to do. It's going to just show you what it's doing right there where you're at. Milkweed's going to show you what it continues to do as it flows. And so I do the same thing in a swamp. If I'm hunting flatland in a swamp, and the buck that I shot yesterday is a great example of this, because the way that my dad, it is your classic Texas type hunt, right? So it's a corn feeder with a shooting house. I haven't shot a deer out of a shooting house in forever. And so it was totally a different thing for me, but it was still pretty cool to see, because the way the shooting house is set up, it's flat land, East Texas swamps. And so there's two sloughs that are a main slough that's holding water, and the feeder is set up right over there by it. Right next to the waterway. And then the let's just call it a creek. We call it sloughs, but let's just call it a creek. It's holding water. It splits off and Y's right there. And the shooting house or the blind is set up right in the middle of that Y. So there's water flowing right on the right side, the left side of it, and then water flowing on the right side. And so even when your thermals start dropping, it's just going to hit that water before it ever gets to the thermal, and it's going to follow the current away. I do the same thing. If I'm setting up in a spot where it's flat swampland, I'm going to try to set up with water in between me and where the deer is, some type of creek system, because that's just a surefire way to make sure that thermals are going to be hopefully in your advantage. And the only thing that's going to change that is if the wind overpowers those thermals. So if you have a wind shift and all of a sudden it starts hitting you in the back of the neck, it might not override it might override the thermals more than you want, and it could push your scent across that waterway. Does that make sense? I know I said a lot right there.
Yeah. And as I normally do, is like, as this is happening, I'm thinking in my head, like all the situations that I've been in, and I'm thinking of like, if you're not learning something when you mess up, then
Yeah,
then
absolutely.
then you're never going to learn. You're just going to repeat it and say, man, that deer did the same thing 3 times in a row. Busted me
Yeah.
right there. Like, instead of trying to figure out why. But I was just thinking about one of the things I forgot to mention in my very verbose intro on the Parker McDonald story, is he's like the king of the kayak and water access. So when you're boating in for these hunts, how far are you generally setting up from the water? Are you using that as one of your main tools, or is it just a way to get away from people?
It's both, man. Originally it was, I just want to get away from people. But you also have the advantage of, um, when you're most of the time. So Alabama is a place in the South. I've seen this in the South more than anything, where mornings are just better, especially on public land where you don't have a lot of like man-made food sources. We don't have a lot of ag. We don't have a lot of you're not. It's illegal to bait, and so most of the stuff that you're hunting is going to be woods, thickets, browse. Browse and acorns is about the only thing that you get as far as food sources. And if you're hunting close to any private land, more than likely they got corn piles, feeders and stuff set up. So you can't really necessarily always compete with that, other than early season when the white oaks are dropping or persimmons or something like that. So because part of the reason why I learned thermals maybe as well as I did was because, hunting as close to the water as I do because I'm using water almost all the time. Most of the creeks have water in them, and so I'm using that as part of my strategy when I access my thermals. Usually in the mornings, right? Your wind isn't blowing really um, until the sun starts coming up, so you got pretty calm conditions most of the time, and the only thing affecting your scent is going to be thermals, and they're going to be pulling right to where I'm at when I access most of the time. Occasionally, every once in a while, I'll pop up to a top of a ridge or something like that on my access, but most of the time I'm accessing through a creek, which is really good. So I definitely use it. But that being said, I hunt anywhere. I have some of my best spots that are uh, a mile away from where my boat's at, 3/4 of a mile away. And then I have some really good spots like this thermal hub that we've been talking about. It's like a 200-yard walk from the boat. If
So
that, it may be closer than that.
so in that 200-yard span, are you still seeing the water affecting the thermals, like what you're saying with the milkweed pulling and just going that way?
Sure, because most of the creeks that I'm walking in on are dumping down into that lake, or a river. I hunt some river bottom type stuff. So most of the creeks that I'm accessing are dumping in to that, and so the current of those creeks, the direction those creeks are flowing is going to be right back to where I just was at, and so it doesn't affect where I'm going nearly as much,
And
right?
it's
So
still cool, so it's still
yeah,
colder
exactly.
that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be pulling down into the main water system and following that current most of the time. And of course, you have your rare days where uh, the wind's just ripping early in the morning, and you might not. It might not work out the same way, but I would say the majority of the time it's pretty calm, and my access is usually pretty good. I will say most of the time, if I blow a deer, it's because I'm getting in super tight to cover, and they just hear me more than anything. I hardly ever get winded by deer on my access, but like I'll have deer blow every once in a while. I get too close to them and they just kind of blow out.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, when you Parker with the filming, and if you follow him on Facebook or Instagram, does a great job of both video but pictorially documenting all the things that are happening. And on the one, it was just like this day thermal hub, this day thermal hub missed or something, and then this day thermal hub, like it was like, and I was like, man, there's got to be something to this, or he's got it dialed in. So I really appreciate the information. Like I said, when you explain it like that, I mean, there's a spot where I've been looking at maps. I'm going to hunt Ohio next year, and I have a spot that looks exactly like that on the map. And I'm not thinking of it like, oh, it's the thermal hub. I'm just thinking, like you said, there's 5 chances to kill deer right in this area. Now, one of the things from that perspective, I guess, is how large are these areas when you're talking about it? Because if I look at a map in Colorado, I might have a whole bunch of draws. However, the distance between them, on the map, it looks like one thing, and then you get out there and you're like, whoa, I can't walk this in a day.
Yeah, and so a thermal hub that really would give you the right effect that you're looking for, because it's the same way for a deer. That buck's looking for a quick way, a spot that he can quickly go around and be able to say a doe was here or a doe wasn't here. He doesn't want to spend all day going around that hub, right? He's got other places, he got other things to do, he's got other spots he needs to check. And so you're talking about, like, if I'm set up right in the middle, the bullseye of it, where all of these things come down, you're talking about I don't know, 80 yards either direction. As far as like let's just say the tops of the ridges. So you're down low, right? Tops of the ridges are 80 to 100 yards to each top And most of the time, you're not going to see those bucks up on the top. They're going to be down lower on the bench, crossing over, going down and going up and down each point coming down. That's what they're doing. They're wanting to get and basically just kind of do a little roundabout, go up and down each one and check it. And if they don't find anything, they'll just go back to cruising one of the other ridges, you know. Very rarely do I see them come down, go around, and then leave the same way that they came. Usually they leave a different way that is a leeward side of a ridge.
Okay. Yeah, like for me, it's a whole new concept, and I would imagine for a lot of people, in having you explain it that way, it is like a high level, a very high level of thinking. But you're right. You know, there's good old boys that say, "Well, we always hunted there, and they didn't think of it like that. They just said, well, my dad hunted here, and he always saw a deer there, and so then I went over there, and there was a crossing, and we just keep sitting there, and I think it's a good spot for the deer." Like,
well, here's the thing. I've had more people since I've started talking about it a lot this season. I've had more people say, "Man, I've been hunting a thermal hub my whole life, and I just didn't know it." You know, I did a whole episode about thermal hubs with my buddy Matthew Reeves. I did a whole podcast about thermal hubs with him. He's a guy from Alabama, just a killer, super cool guy. Does YouTube and stuff as well. And he had a year, a week, probably a month ago in late November around Thanksgiving. I think it was Thanksgiving week actually. And he killed 2 really good public land deer for Alabama. And one of them was the biggest buck he's ever killed. And he started explaining the place to me. I was like, "Man, that's a thermal hub." He's like, "Yeah, you know, whatever." And so we get on a podcast, and I'm like, "Hey, I just killed a buck on thermal hub. You just killed 2 bucks on a thermal hub. Let's do a podcast about it." And so we got on it, and he was like, "Man, I'm gonna be honest with you. I didn't even know it was a thermal hub." And you find that a lot. Like people are like, "Man, I don't know why bucks are here, you know, during the rut. I don't know, but they're always here. Seems like a good spot." And then they start looking at it or hear you talk about it and really like, "Man, everything he's describing sounds exactly like that spot that always produces bucks." And that's why. I mean, most people have probably hunted one and they just didn't know it.
Yeah, very, very eye-opening for me. So, but like I said, I think we covered everything that I wanted. I know you're, basically on vacation down visiting family, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this for us. So when people want to watch these videos, where you've got them, you produce them in a like ridiculous turnaround time. So you've got
I normally do.
some
I
of these
haven't
out.
this year.
No,
This year I've been like, so this is a funny thing. I started my own business this year, so I'm completely self-employed. I can pretty much hunt as much as I want, which is awesome. So freaking cool. Whenever I started the business, I was like, "Oh yeah, man, I'm gonna be able to produce videos like crazy. I'm just gonna like, I'll have all this extra time. I can decide when I want to work and when I want to hunt and when I want to edit. Once I shoot a buck, I'm gonna have this video up in a day." Well, what I found was that requires a whole lot of discipline when you don't have a boss telling you can't go hunt. It's like, I'm like, "Okay, I killed my buck. Now I just want to go hunt again and kill another one." And so I have been falling behind on my editing. And I have now 3 bucks left that I still need to edit for this season. And one of them is a thermal hub buck, the one I tagged out on in Alabama. So yeah, I definitely have my work cut out for me for the next probably, I don't know, probably this next week. But I do have that hunt, like I said, in Florida and a hunt in Mississippi, possibly a bonus buck hunt in Alabama at the end of this week. So on Saturday, New Year's Day, I may be going to do one of these bonus buck hunts in Alabama. And it just makes it hard to edit. So, but yeah, you can watch it all on Southern Ground Hunting on YouTube. I'm going to try to have these up pretty quickly. And then, of course, the podcast on Sportsman's Nation Podcast Network. You just type in Southern Ground Hunting on any podcast platform, then Southern Ground Hunting on Facebook and Instagram. And I try to post pretty regularly on those too.
Okay. You want to plug your business too? I mean, I know there's people out there that are
Sure. This is cool because the majority of my business has come from people who listen to me. I had one guy who was like, "Hey, I heard you on the Whitetail Legacy podcast." And then I looked you up and I saw that you had this graphic design business or whatever, and I need some stuff. So yeah, I do graphic design, website design. So if you need business cards, wedding invites, logo made for your business, anything like that, look up White Hawk Creative. So the color white, or I guess lack of color white. Hawk like the bird, Creative Co on it's whitehawkcreative.co on my website, and then I got Facebook, Instagram as well on there. So yeah, if anybody needs anything like that, let me know. Pay some of my bills. That'd be awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, look, get this guy some money so he can get an editor for all these videos, because
No joke. I need one.
killing all these deer. But I really do appreciate it, Parker. Thanks so much
man,
for taking the time.
I always enjoy coming on. I hate that we're not going to be able to link up at ATA this year, but
I know that dang Walter.
I know I can't pass up a good Florida hunt, man. I got to kill me and Walter have a this is the deal. If I shoot a legal buck in Florida, I don't care what it is. It may look like the buck you have on the wall back there. 6 point, whatever, a small basket rack 6 point. I'm getting it shoulder mounted. So
okay,
that's the deal. Florida buck is high on my bucket list, so definitely want to do that. So I'll get it shoulder. The first legal buck I kill in Florida, I'm getting shoulder mounted.
I'm waiting for that Whitetail Cribs Parker McDonald trail cam video.
they would all my stuff is hung up. I have a tiny little office that's like built for a midget. I don't know why the people made it this way, but it's a basement office, and all of my stuff is in this little office. Looks like it's just tiny. It's like a 8 by 10 room with like 7 foot ceilings. It's pretty ridiculous.
Nice,
So,
nice. Yeah, well, I mean that, you know, the 4 point from Florida, that's full shoulder mount, you know, pedestal mount, I think would look really good.
that would look good. I don't know that a 4 point is legal in Florida. So it has to be a 6 point, which at least a 6 point be. People come in and be like, "Is that your first deer?" It's like, no, not my first deer. that is just my most. I'm more proud of that deer. I will be more proud of a Florida buck than I will be of almost anything.
I just want to see you do it just to show Walter how easy it is. Like,
yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to the most.
Oh, well, awesome. We look forward to seeing that. And yeah, I'll have a beer or two for you down there. And
in my honor, man. All right. That'd be awesome.